Sometimes you look at Victorian photographs and shudder how strange and often monstrous they are in the literal sense of the word. Photographs of dead people, compiled and recorded in such a way as to appear alive, images of physical disabilities and injuries, collages with severed heads and ghosts made during a long exposure. Who needed these photos and why? Let's look through the old album and try to find an explanation for the content of its pages. The explanation for this tradition, widespread from the 1860s to the early 1910s, is extremely simple. At that time, almost no one had their own cameras, and then collodion photography was a complex technology and required a professional approach. Almost no private pictures were taken. The photographer's work was prestigious and required high qualifications, so they paid very well for it. Going to the studio for family photography was expensive, and only wealthy people could afford to invite a photographer to their home. They prepared in advance for the photo shoot, did their hair, put on the best costumes. That's why the people in the pictures of the 19th century seemed so proud and beautiful. They just posed very diligently. Remember, for example, the famous photo of Butch Cassidy's Wild Gang. Wanted criminals are dressed to the nines, in brand new suits and bowler hats, look like real dandies, and do not hesitate to act. Why? Yes, since the photographer received a good fee and was not deprived of self-esteem, Cassidy wanted to have a beautiful photo of his organization. These people robbed banks and trains in a completely different way. So, because of the high prices for pictures and the complexity of the process, many simply did not have time to take pictures during their lifetime. This was especially true of children. Infant mortality in the 19th century was monstrous and at the same time completely habitual. There were many children in the families. On average, 2 to 3 out of 10 children died of diseases in the absence of antibiotics, vaccines, and other modern means. Old people were also rarely photographed during their lifetime, for there were no photos in their youth, and in old age they were no longer up to it. As a result, people realized that they did not have family photos, only after the death of someone close to them. A photographer was immediately hastily hired. The body was smeared with lipstick and seated in a live pose. Often such pictures were, as a rule, the only ones on which the deceased was captured. The middle-aged deceased, from 20 to 60 years old, were filmed much less often because they usually managed to take pictures during their lifetime. Photographers made good money on this genre. There were many tricks and devices that made it possible to pass off a dead person as a living person. For example, specialized patented props for giving the deceased a natural pose, although most often they took a photo in which the deceased imitated the sleeper. Spacers were inserted into the eyes, and the pupils were turned so that the deceased looked into the camera. Sometimes it was impossible to guess at all that a dead man was in the picture, except for a barely noticeable tripod at his feet. Sometimes photographs of famous dead people were sold as souvenirs. For example, in 1882, after looking at the body of the murdered Robert Jesse James, exhibited for edifying purposes, you could buy a photo of his corpse at the exit. The genre began to decline in the early 20th century, and by the 1920s it had completely disappeared. Compact personal cameras became widespread, shooting became ubiquitous and cheap, and it was difficult to find a person who never got into the lens. And we have a lot of nightmarish photos left in our memory. However, many of them seem very elegant and interesting, until you guess that the Victorian beauties depicted on them are dead. Many children did not have lifetime photos because it is difficult to sit the child down and make him not twitch, and the excerpts in those days were very long. If it was necessary to photograph a child alone, without a mother, the photographers of the 19th century used a simple trick. The mother was sitting on a chair, and she was carefully draped, covering her hands, face, and legs as if she were a piece of furniture. The child was placed on his mother's lap, where he could behave decently for a while. At the same time, from the photographer's side, everything looked as if there was no one in the picture except the child. However, if you look closely, these photos create an eerie feeling. It is noticeable that the man is sitting motionless under the blanket in the dark. It seems that he is about to jump out and devour an unsuspecting innocent child. On May 23, 1878, a young British photographer, Samuel K. Balbirnie from Brighton, Sussex, UK, placed an ad in the Brighton Daily News newspaper, which later became famous and gave rise to a whole genre of photo manipulation. It read, "Perfume photos, the ladies and gentlemen in the photos will be flying through the air in the company of tables, chairs, and musical instruments. Headless photos, the ladies and gentlemen in the photos will hold their own heads in their hands. Photos of dwarfs and giants, it's really funny." There were a lot of photographers in Brighton, and Balbirnie, who opened a photo studio, wanted to stand out. And he invented a method of photo manipulation based on combining several negatives. In fact, it became the forerunner of modern Photoshop. Oddly enough, Balbirnie's idea was not a success. Accustomed to traditional photography, the residents of Brighton were in no hurry to shoot in a decapitated or flying form. 2 years later, the photographer closed the studio and left to serve as an army doctor. But, oddly enough, his business continued to live on. Several photos taken by Balbirnie were distributed not only in the personal albums of clients, but also in newspapers. As a result, dozens of photographers in England and abroad have mastered the simplest manipulations with negatives. Headless portraits became a popular genre of photography and remained in fashion until the 1910s. By the way, most likely, Balbirnie was not the inventor of this technology. At least one headless photograph is known, taken in 1875, before the studio opened, by another master from Brighton, William Henry Wheeler. He kept a photo salon on the High Street. But Wheeler did not advertise his Photoshop as openly as Balbirnie, and did not become the founder of a new direction. Bennett was the son of a Surrey hatter, but in the 1870s decided to open a business selling photographic equipment. In 1878, trying to find a way to shorten the shutter speed, he realized that the collodion process could not be accelerated in any way, and a radically new emulsion composition was needed for instant image fixation. By that time, another photographer, the English Dr. Richard Maddox, had already achieved success in this field, replacing the collodion with gelatin. But he could not achieve sufficient speed of fixing due to the fact that there was too much liquid in the gelatin. Bennett undertook to improve the method of Maddox and quickly achieved success. He managed to reduce the shutter speed from a few seconds to 1 second. First of all, Bennett decided to show the technology to the military and American, not British, and he needed a spectacular and at the same time effective experiment. He chose a peculiar way of demonstrating. He tied dynamite to the neck of a mule, mounted the camera on a tripod, and then blew up the animal's head in the presence of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Abbott of the U.S. Army and several other servicemen from the Willets Point base, New York. He managed to take a picture at a moment when the fragments of the head were already flying apart, but the mule's body was still standing, not having time to fall. This demonstrated the speed of photography. The description of the experiment and the results of Bennett's work were published in the journal Scientific American. The technology was successfully implemented. Bennett received a patent and earned it on his invention. But the press heaped a mountain of criticism on him for the cruel treatment of an animal. Since Bennett's father was a hatter, some newspapers played up the phrase "mad as a hatter" from Alice in Wonderland. Another popular direction of photographs of the 19th century is people who are clearly being tortured by someone. Whips on the back, shocks, squeezes the head with a vice. In fact, there is absolutely nothing terrible about most of these photos. Imagine that a person who has never been to the dentist will see a photo of you sitting with your mouth wide open, and some guy climbs in there with terrible tools. He'll be terrified, won't he? Therefore, when we first encounter long-forgotten and sometimes erroneous medical methods of the 19th century, we are horrified, although at that time they seemed completely normal. For example, a photo is widely distributed on the web in which a slender, half-naked woman is tied by the hands to a strange cone-shaped frame. A fully clothed middle-aged man is standing nearby and seems to be looking at a woman's breasts. What is this, a Victorian BDSM club? No, of course not. This photo only illustrates the method of correction of scoliosis, developed by the famous American orthopedic surgeon Louis Sayre. He was a true revolutionary in his field. With the help of a cone-shaped frame, Sayre temporarily straightened the spine crippled by scoliosis, and then tightly bandaged the patient, not allowing him to bend again. After several weeks of such procedures, the spine has noticeably straightened. The photo with the girl is best known due to the fact that her heroine is young, slim, and looks mysterious and erotic. In fact, there are many photos of Sayre at work. Most of them depict men with round bellies or, conversely, bony, with hairy, but sticking out of slid trousers. Of course, a really beautiful photo has become popular. And, by the way, you have not yet seen other devices for the correction of scoliosis, common in the 19th century. French neurologist Guillaume Duquesne, who lived in the 19th century, studied the reaction of muscles and nerves to electrical impulses. Subsequently, his work formed the basis of the electroneuromyography, a diagnostic test that allows you to detect nerve damage. Among other things, Duquesne recorded the facial expressions of patients when impulses were applied to a certain facial nerve. The problem was that photographing with a long exposure did not allow such a procedure. But Duquesne was lucky. He had at his disposal a middle-aged shoemaker who suffered from facial nerve paralysis, Bell's palsy. In other words, if Duquesne received some kind of expression on the patient's face with the help of a current, it remained there unchanged for several minutes until the muscle did not let go. This made it possible to take a high-quality picture with a long exposure. The doctor conducted more than 100 experiments with a shoemaker, connecting electrodes to various muscles and getting a variety of facial expressions. The study, provided with images, was published under the title The Mechanism of Human Physiognomy. Thanks to this work, Duquesne determined the purpose of a number of facial muscles and, in particular, revealed the mechanism of a smile. Phineas Gage was an American railroad man, an expert on explosives. On September 13, 1848, 25-year-old Gage was preparing to blow up a rock near Cavendish during the laying of a section of the railroad between the cities of Rathmond and Burlington in Vermont. He had to drill a hole in the right place on the rock, put explosives and a wick there, tamper with everything, and seal the hole with sand, releasing part of the wick outside. At the moment when Gage raised the pin over the hole where the explosives had already been placed, he was distracted by one of the workers. Gage turned around and automatically dropped the pin. From the impact, the powder caught fire and exploded. The pin entered Gage's cheekbone under his left eye, pierced his skull, and came out of the top of his head. So that you understand, this thing was 3.2 centimeters in diameter, more than a meter in length, and weighed 6 kilograms. After passing through the skull, the pin flew off, spraying blood and brains, 25 meters up, and fell nearby. But Gage somehow survived. At first he fell and twitched in convulsions, then calmed down, regained consciousness, and with the help of colleagues got to the hotel where the workers lived, 1.2 kilometers from the scene. When Surgeon Edward Williams arrived there half an hour later, Gage was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, hastily bandaged. After 2 months, Gage returned to active life, outwardly losing only his left eye. But his personality changed dramatically. Friends and relatives claimed that this is no longer our Phineas. As a result of the injury, he lost 4% of the cerebral cortex and 11% of the white matter, as well as connections between different parts of the brain. For 12 years, Phineas Gage was studied by the best specialists. Based on this case, a number of patterns were identified for which one or another part of the brain is responsible. 2 photos of Gage were taken. He is sitting on both of them, elegantly dressed, and holding in his hands the very pin that pierced his head. Phineas Gage died in 1860 from an epileptic seizure caused by an old injury. His skull is preserved at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard. This expression could not be more suitable for most vintage photos in which something strange is happening. In fact, there is nothing unusual about this. We just are not used to this reality, because we live in another one. Pictures of, say, the animal world, when a female praying mantis eats a male after mating or some other abomination occurs, sometimes seem to us just as strange and monstrous. Every Victorian photograph, like any modern one, has a subtext, a story, an explanation, without which it is unclear what is happening on it. And when you get to know them better, suddenly it's not scary at all. Or, on the contrary, even more inconvenient. It's up to you.